And now we're actually live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the live stream. My name is Julia Morgan, aka Morgan Scorpion. Tonight, I'm extremely grateful to be able to welcome author Laird Barron.
Julia, thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I'm going to start off with a question that I ask nearly everybody, and that is, were there any local legends or haunted houses where you grew up?
Not per se. There were a lot of interesting things where I grew up. Landmarks that had sort of history, but nothing haunted. But I will say this: I think the wilderness of
Yeah.
Alaska is somewhat haunted, just as a rule.
Mm.
I've written about this, talked about it. Alaska is one of those places where people go to lose themselves. At least when
Mm.
I was growing up there in the 70s and 80s, and it's one of those places where people go to lose themselves. And I, it has a very high crime rate, a very high incident rate of just unusual isolation based madness. A lot of what they call cabin fever. It seems to be like a virulent strain of it up in Alaska.
Mm.
And just about everybody up there that I grew up around, from all walks of life, um, had a story, a ghost story, or a story about inexplicable events. But strangely enough, there were very few uh, like legends about a haunted place. There were stretches of
Yeah.
wilderness that were considered spooky, but but not like a famous haunted house or anything, which I think is kind of
Yeah.
weird.
Is it Wendigo territory?
You know, I assume so. Although the natives in Alaska, they have different names for things, but I never heard. I was never exposed to the word Wendigo until I started reading like literature from other states and classic literature
Mm.
and stuff. Um, I will say that my dad had a strange experience out on the ice, the sea ice, the Bering Sea, back in the
Yeah.
'80s. He was racing his sled dogs, and there's a place called Norton Sound, and it's between Koyuk and Elam. If you look on a
Yeah.
map, if you keep going north, there's Nome. So basically, it's a little south of Nome, and out in the middle of nowhere. And there are villages. There's native villages, kind of along the coast there. But instead of traveling along the coastline, there's a couple places where in the winter when the ice freezes, people will just travel right across the ice and cut off many miles that way. It's still 50 or 60 mile straight shot, but as opposed to like 120 or
Yeah.
150. And my dad was out there one year, and he was not too far from the from the village of Elam. Middle of the night, uh, it was a light snow was falling, like that really fine stinging snow, and he couldn't see very far. It was like the light was his headlamp. He had a miner's lamp he was using, was reflecting back at him, and he realized the dogs were looking around like there was something out there. And of course, we're on the sea ice. There's really nothing out there generally,
Mm.
and he saw huge shapes the size of bear around him, 3 or 4 different shapes pacing him, and he thought he was, he assumed maybe I'm hallucinating because there's no polar bear quite that far south. You're still a couple hundred miles from where polar bear are usually seen.
Mhm.
So he was like, and of course it's March, so there's no, it's not going to be a grizzly or something like that, especially not 5 or 6 of them. But this went on for a while, and the dogs got really agitated. They definitely saw something, and then he pulled into the checkpoint. And when he was talking to some of the native people there, the villagers, they were telling him, "Oh yeah, I don't remember the name, but they said that, oh yeah, you ran into basically a spirit. They hang out on the ice, and you're trespassing essentially, and they will try to herd you or lure you out into open water." Um, so maybe not specifically the Wendigo, but definitely it was a malevolent. And it was funny because they were speaking to my dad about it. Is like, oh yeah, you saw a seagull. There was no, they weren't surprised, or there was no,
Yeah.
it wasn't like, oh, you saw that. No, they were just like, oh yeah, yeah, be careful.
there weren't seals?
There could be seals, but not where they were. The ice was way
Yeah,
too thick.
yeah.
We're talking like it was really, really, really thick ice, and also they were
Mm,
whatever they were the size. They were much bigger than a seal. They were the size of like he thought he was being paced by bears. That's how big they were.
yeah.
So it could be he was hallucinating. I mean, I've talked about that
Hmm.
before. He doesn't know what he saw. He just
Yeah.
saw shapes, and it went on for about 15, 20 minutes. And he was traveling, I would say probably around 10 miles an hour. He was traveling
Mm.
at a nice trot with the dog team. So either he was hallucinating or it was something very interesting was going on.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that there aren't spirits because who knows? I haven't been everywhere, and I've heard enough spooky stories from people I respect to well, it's not me who decides what exists and what doesn't. That's up to a much higher power, I think.
Right.
But
I'm
so
I will just say that I've had a lot of weird
mm,
inexplicable things happen to me over the years, and I'm quite comfortable with saying I don't know.
yeah,
That's my
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what it was,
Hmm.
and I'm quite comfortable with that.
Yes. Yes, I've come to change my mind a lot over the last few years. But anyway, so I'm going to go back again to what was your very first exposure to fictional horror?
Hmm. Probably that I can remember. I was about 3 years old, and a movie called "Don't Be Afraid of the Dark" aired on network television.
Oh gosh,
I think
yes.
right. It's about the couple that buys an old farmhouse, and there's something
Hmm.
living under the farmhouse, like little people, and it's really
Oh yeah.
creepy. And I was 3 years old, and it just that that really worked on me.
Mm,
And then fiction, in fiction, I think probably my first that I can remember, probably Edgar Allan Poe.
mm,
For I, probably in third grade, fourth grade, started reading Edgar Allan Poe. My mom had a lot of books when we moved out because when
yeah.
I was about between 9 and 10, that's when we moved out into the wilderness. And but my mom had just lots of books, like hundreds and hundreds of books. And
Mm,
one of the things she had like a set of encyclopedia like Britannica, and she had Gray's Anatomy, and she also had like I forget what they were called, but they were like you know cloth bound, but hardcovers, but with a with a cloth bound, and they were blue books, and they were I think they called them a treasury, like treasury books, and so it would be like
yeah.
the abridged treasury of Edgar Allan Poe, Browning, the poet, we had Treasure Island, we had Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we had all that kind of stuff, and I think that was kind of the first, in literature. I think Poe would probably be among the first people that I recall um, being spooked.
Mm. I just that I remember seeing Don't Be Afraid of the Dark when I was 14, 15, or 16. Scared the living daylights out of me.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah,
yeah, one of the few times after about the age of 11 when I was scared to go up to bed. But
right. Because they could be anywhere. They could
oh
be in the
yes.
the floral array. There was remember that one scene that they were like
Mm,
hiding in the flowers and in the house and
that was the one that did it for me. The faces just looked so malevolent.
yep.
They really wanted to hurt you. Oh
And they
my
wanted to
God.
drag
And
her.
you
They
you got to watch that when you were 3.
right. I watched it whenever or 3 or 4. Whenever at first I
Mm,
was a toddler, and I don't think my parents realized what it was because I remember we
mm,
were visiting my grandparents and there was a lot of hubbub going on, and I remember just sitting in front of the TV by myself, which was
mm.
unusual. So I ended up watching it, unsupervised. This is the '70s, though.
Yeah,
Moms had a cigarette in one hand and a martini in the other era. So plug your kid
yeah.
into like a horror movie. That's fine.
Nobody expected the TV movies to be scary, though,
Probably
because I
not, but
remember seeing a lot of them, and yeah.
I think that's a there. That's funny. There were some good scary movies in the '70s
Mm,
and TV movies, and one or two in the '80s. There was some horror anthology in the early '80s. There were three or four, like each one was 20 minutes long. And I
yeah.
remember, like one was a woman who'd lost her child drowning, and so the whole episode was her husband went out of town, and she's doing a ritual to try to summon him back to life. Oh my goodness! Like as an
That
adult,
sounds
this is 40 years ago now, and I'm still kind of creeped out by it. So every now and then, man, they would come up with something, wouldn't they?
yeah. Yeah, I remember one called A Journey into the Unknown. I don't know if you ever saw that one. Or of course you would have seen The Twilight Zone and Night Gallery,
Of
which
course, love Night Gallery
y-
and
yeah,
Tales from the Dark Side.
vaguely remember that. It wasn't that a book by Dennis Etchison.
I can't remember
Oh
what.
well.
Right, he did something or Tales from or Night Country. Etchinson
That's
was,
it. That's it.
yeah, he was. I haven't read all of his stuff. I've read like a representative
Mm,
sample of his stuff. He was really good. But yeah, the Night Country,
yeah.
and
So
he has,
you
of course,
remember?
that famous story. Sometimes they come out at night about the couple driving, on the highway. That's really the guy was really great.
Oh, that rings a bell. The title does.
Yeah, I think that's
I'll have to
probably
look that up
among
then.
his most famous stories. Sometimes I want to say, if I could be butchering the title, but yeah, or they come out at night. I think it's they come out at night. But
Mm.
yeah, it's just about a guy driving across the country with his wife, and he stops at a rest stop. Unfortunately for him,
Well, as they say, never leave the city. But of course, people do all the time.
that's
But
right.
yeah. So you were a fisherman on the Bering Sea. What was
Yeah,
that like?
I was less a fisherman and more working like in the belly of trawlers and stuff. But
Oh,
like I've done a lot of fishing like on rivers and things. But yeah, I
mm,
worked on the Bering Sea and in a factory, like in factory vessels and things like that, back in my teens and early 20s. Like it's
mm-hmm.
been most of my life since I've been out there. But yeah, when I was I think the last time I was out on the Bering was like 1995 or 6. It was a seasonal thing, in the wintertime
Oh,
I had sled dogs, and then this was from the time I was a teenager until I was in my mid
mm,
20s, early 20s. And so in the
yeah,
summertime I would work usually commercial fishing of some kind, and it was
yeah.
usually a lot of times it was factory work. Like I worked for several years at a land-based factory in Anchorage, but some construction, just whatever I could do in the summer for 4 or 5 months out of the year, and then the other 7 months I would go up into the mountains or into the wilderness and be with my dogs. And that went on pretty much until I was in mid '90s, and then I
Yeah.
moved to Seattle, got out of it, became a writer.
Was it much of a culture shock moving to Seattle?
Certainly was. Alaska's its own. Alaska is just a very strange insular place. I mean, and I'm speaking about Alaska that I know, not the
Yeah.
Alaska that may exist today. As far as I know, things may have changed, but yeah, '70s, '80s, and '90s is what I can speak to, and it was very insular,
Mm,
very conservative, but in a way that's not reflective of other. Like when you talk about American conservatism, the conservatism of Alaska was really different, even than Texas or some of the other southern states. Similar, but different. And as I said at the outset, a lot of people were moving to Alaska, kind of almost like on the run. Some of them literally were on the run, but a lot of people just moved
yeah.
up there because they didn't fit in anywhere, including
Yeah.
Texas or Louisiana or any place like that. They wanted to go as far away from the rest of the country as they could get, and consequently, that's how I was raised. I didn't have a say in it, and I didn't know any different. And then, of course, my dad took it a step further, and it wasn't enough for us to be living in Alaska. We had to go
Mm,
live in the middle of nowhere for years, and So I moved from that to almost, I went out on my own for a few years, but I still was
Yeah.
just living in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. And I went from a cabin in the middle of nowhere to um, Seattle, and that was quite an eye opener. Um,
Mm,
it took me it took me a little bit to get acclimated to it, but it really changed me as a person. Within a year or two, I had really started thawing out from kind of this frigid. My heart was very frigid when I moved to Seattle. I
yeah.
was very, I think, just to survive up there, the way that we were raised, and just the lifestyle I'd kind of been uh, put, or set upon the life path I'd been set upon. I, once I sort of left that and decided that I wanted to do something else in my life, within a couple of years of living in the lower 48, I was really beginning to examine my assumptions about life,
Yeah.
and I'm glad that I did. I think I'm a much better for it all these years later.
Do you miss Alaska at all?
Not even a little bit. Not at all. Like none. I now,
Mm,
that's not to say that I don't appreciate. Because here's the thing.
yeah.
I feel like I kind of escaped Alaska. I very easily could have
Mm,
been one of those people who woke up, and I'm in my mid 50s now, and I never, I'm still living in that cabin somewhere, and I never rode, I never did it, never traveled, never did anything except just kind of like farm life. And that would have been fine, but I felt like there was more, I had done that. And that's the
mm,
thing about it. I have 25 years of Alaska life under my belt that'll always be
yeah.
part of me. And it makes me the person and the writer that I am. And I am grateful for that kind of toughness that was
Yeah.
sort of thrust upon me. You have to survive. You have to be tough and survive.
Yeah.
But that said, I don't want to go back. I don't think of it fondly. I miss my
Mm,
dogs. I miss certain aspects, but in general, I wouldn't. I could be, offered a free house up there and $1 million a year, and
yeah.
I don't would not be all that tempted to move back.
Yes, yes, I escaped my hometown of Exeter with pretty much the same feelings. But we've got a bit of a request from a member of the audience. I'll just put it up on the screen. This is Kat Hargreave. She would love to hear about the dog team, if you want to talk about that for a bit.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what really to say except that when we were when we first moved out into the wilderness, um, and I say that literally, like, we lived in the country prior to that. I live in the country now in some ways, but this was wilderness. This was a cabin on a hill. The only way you can get to it is by a riverboat in the summertime, or a float plane. There's no roads. You can't walk to it. It's just literally too far out in the middle of nowhere. And in the wintertime, you can travel once again by plane or snowmobile or dog team. And
Mm,
my dad ended up getting a bunch of sled dogs. I shouldn't say a bunch. I mean, we only probably had 20 or so, but he assembled a team, and he was using the team for freighting. So
mm,
basically, he'd get in front of them and snowshoe until we could reach a trail. And there were often trails on the river because we lived next to a very large river, and snowmobilers would travel up and down the river, and so there'd be a path, and the dog team would just go down that, and my dad would haul supplies because he would have to mush into town, which is about 6 7 hour trip. And he had a friend that had a place where he could keep the dogs, and then he would go into the city and do whatever arcane stuff he needed to do to get food and supplies, and then they'd come back. And that's basically, what we had going for a few years. And then he got into racing was starting to take off in Alaska. And racing is just simply the stuff that he was involved in, and I was, for a few years in my youth. Is more just like traveling. There'll be a start position, some small town, and you'll go do a big loop, out in the wilderness, and come back, and it's, anywhere from a day to 2 weeks, depending on how long the race is. And there were prizes for that. and that's kind of how we survived. Actually, when I was a kid, my dad was the same thing. He was a welder and he did all kinds of manual labor stuff. But in the wintertime, it was, uh, traveling with the dog team, either through freighting or through racing. And when I talk about never wanting to go back to Alaska, I still miss. I don't miss racing at all. Because that was the thing, is
Yeah.
I found out. So I raced a bit when I was a teenager, and then I left home when I was 17 or so, and I raced for another 6 years, 7 years, and I just figured out that that's not. As time went on, I just realized, even though I'd been brought up that this is your life, this is what you're going to do the rest of your life, is basically what I was told. I just I was just disenchanted with it. I liked the dogs, but I never
Yeah.
really cared about racing at all. I found, as I
Yeah.
as I got older and kind of had my own thoughts about things, I realized this is not me. This is not who I am. And I look
Yeah.
back on that and I go, I could easily see, having some pets, and we go ski oring, we get cross country skis on and have 3 or 4 dogs follow you around, or just have some sled dog, huskies as pets. But the idea of going back to work dogs situation, I just
Yeah.
have no. There's not. That's done for me.
When did you start writing?
I started writing when I was about 5 years old, and I actually tried to write before I could read. I was just, for whatever reason, I was always fascinated with the idea. Some kids draw. I was
Yeah.
fascinated with the idea of writing. I can't explain it. It was simply, I wanted to communicate through the written word, and I learned to read very young, and I started writing stories, probably coherent stories, when I was about 6.
And I was very intrigued to find, because my first contact with you that I recall is asking for permission to record Shiva Open Your Eye. And I just found out today that that was your very first published story.
It was my first professional. It was my second published story, but yeah.
All right.
So you're technically correct. It's my first pro. The I had a story accepted and published the summer before. That was in 2001. In the summer of
Hmm.
2000, I had a story published by a very venerable magazine now, or e-zine, Three Lobed Burning Eye, which a lot of people, Gemma Files has been in it. A lot of
Hmm.
people, notable people, have been in it. Um, and I misunderstood. I thought that it was supposed to be like a penny a word, and turned out it was just contributors' copies or something, which is fine. So
Mm.
I had a story called "The Hour of the Cyclops" or "Hour of the Cyclops" came out in that. But yeah, Shiva was the first actual pro story that I had published.
So I was sort of extremely impressed with that one. But I think the person who first introduced me to your work was Joe Pulver. And
Good old Joe.
I mean, yeah, I know, lovely man,
Yep.
much missed. But so, we'll strike now. So I was going to ask, where did Old Leech come from?
Ah, so Old Leech came along a few years later. I want to say 2006, 2007, and Old Leech kind of was derived from a conversation I had at a convention. I was sitting around drunkenly talking
Hmm.
with Paul Tremblay and John Langan, and I'm sure there was other people there, but those are the two that really stick out, because we talked about, um, not as a joke, but kind of like the old Lovecraft circle. Hey,
Yeah.
I should have this character pop up, and you can have this character of mine pop up in one of your stories if you want. Well, okay, yeah. And John Langan was telling a story about, he and his wife Fiona had been on a trip years before, and they found a travel guide stuffed in the back of, they were, I don't know where they were, but it was like one of those pamphlets that, like, bicyclists, cross country, people that are traveling on bicycle, they'll have, hey, stay at this farmer's place or stay at this hostel. that kind of stuff. Kind of like almost not quite an almanac. I kind of added that to it, but basically just a travel guide. And we started talking about what if that thing just started appearing everywhere, and what if it, and of course the Black Guide came out of that. This book with nondescript book that's almost like a travel guide to the occult, and also like an almanac. There's like some other creepy stuff about it, and that it's different every time you find a copy of it. But the basic premise is the same, that it's a guide to the occult and landmarks and things. And so we were talking about that, and so I wrote. I'm trying to think which of my stories it was. It might have been the Broadsword, but I was working on one of my first Old Leech stories. Well, the first Old Leech story was the Broadsword, which came out like it was Joshi, St. Joshi bought it for his Black Wings, his first Black Wings anthology. And the monster, though, I wanted to do something Lovecraftian because I was playing around at that time. I was playing around with with Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and I said, all right, I want to create my own bad guy, like a Cthulhu type creature, but that's still recognizably Lovecraftian. And so I was talking to John, and John had written a story called On Skua Island. It came out actually like in 2003, and there's a scene in that story where the protagonist, he's I want to say an archaeologist, and he finds some like runes, and there's one of the symbols is of a worm like thing that's slithering. And I said, and it was just a talk. He didn't do anything with it, didn't develop it. It was just a throwaway line. It was like the protagonist is reading stuff, trying to figure out what's going on with this mummy monster, and he sees this worm-like rune. And I said, hey, can I use that? Can I put that in a story? And he said, sure. And I decided, though, that worms, as much as they're creepy, have been other people have done them. You got the worm that walks, right? Ramsey Campbell. I mean, there's all this stuff. And so I said, nah. I want to do something that's even more. What's more intimidating than a worm? And I went, oh, I had a bad experience with leeches when I was a little kid. I think a leech probably is one up a giant leech would one up a worm, as far as I was concerned. Yeah. So that's what happened. That was the genesis of Old Leech.
So we've got a question here from another viewer I'll just put up. M. Crawford would like to know what got you into cosmic horror.
I think that's a great question. It's one of those things that there's probably not just any one there's probably not just any one source. I think just as time went on, probably exposure to a lot of things just crystallized. But my mom was a fundamentalist, or is a fundamentalist Christian, and I honestly feel, and I've spoken to this many times, that her interpretation of the Old Testament had as much to do with turning me toward cosmic horror as a concept, because the way that she would talk about Old Testament God and point out passages in the Bible was pretty terrifying. And that was her intent. She said God is terrifying. God could crush you like a worm. You're not even a flea to God. God exists outside of time. I remember that was one of the ones that stuck in my mind. I'm 10, 11 years old, and I'm trying to, I'm asking questions as kids do. But why does God do this? And why does God do that? And I'll never forget, she said, well, God created time for man. God doesn't experience time like we do. God, he or it is outside of time. And that really worked in my little impressionable brain. That and the idea that Jesus, the Holy Trinity, that whole thing. I'm like, wait a minute. So Jesus is not a man. Jesus is a spirit inside basically a skin suit, is what you're saying. That he's like, that Jesus's body is like, because once Jesus dies, right, boom, apparates back to heaven to report to the big guy. And so I'm like, as I got a little bit older, like a teenager, and this is what happened with Shiva, why I wrote Shiva, I was like, well, what would it be like if we were trying to communicate with, man, a scientist was trying to communicate with an ant colony? You can't really communicate with them on their level, even though we can predict their behavior. We're probably godlike in size and scope and ability compared to them. we're not omnipotent. How do we
Mm,
communicate with them? And my thought was, oh, you would create a sensor device. You would create like a mini ant that you
mm,
could use nanotechnology, and you could have it produce pheromones and all this stuff, and you would deploy it amongst the ants, and then you could somehow collect data from the ants, and then we could try to translate it to something we could use, and vice versa. And so I was like, oh, so God is this impossible, according to my mother, God is
mm.
incomprehensible, impossible to understand being that's so far beyond us that we would be, smote blind and dumb and deaf if we ever looked upon his glory. And so obviously he put some of his essence inside something that looks like us so that he can communicate with us, because he can't talk to us with his real voice, all that good stuff. So yeah, this is all that was just I was lying awake at night for many years from the time I was about 10, maybe 9, 10 years old, working on that problem. And it's no wonder that adult Laird, relies on that for material.
Right, because I read a bit of a quote recently that yes, the Bible was a great source of horror for you. I'm reminded of so many different things. I'm probably going to completely lose track of my thoughts here. But remembering the written thing that it is a dreadful thing to come face to face with the living God. No man may look upon the face of God and live. But I remember reading about Ezekiel and the chariot and the living and the furnace and the. So if you think about it, the biblical angels being
Yes.
of the Old Testament having multiple eyes and huge circles and 12 different pairs of wings and four heads and
Yeah.
yes, it is all pretty terrifying stuff.
Right.
It
And
is.
my mom was very much to heck with
Mm,
the New Testament. She was all down with the Old Testament. So if you look at it, just
mm,
you know, I want to say objectively, like a kid does. I, and I was also a very belligerent, bellicose, and rebellious child. So
mm,
I think it's one of the reasons that I was able to escape my indoctrination, because that's pretty much what was going on at my house until I got away. It's why I
yeah.
was able to escape, is I just, I was being indoctrinated, and not necessarily in a nefarious, like, sinister way. It's just what these fundamentalist parents will do. And
Yeah.
as like that's just their nature, that she thinks she's doing the best for me,
Yeah,
and my
that's what
dad's
they
like,
believe. They really believe.
yeah.
Yeah.
And of course my dad's not religious, but he's essentially what I would term a survivalist slash white separatist. He certainly was not, had no friends that weren't white.
Yeah.
Didn't really like people in general, and wanted to be out in the woods all the time because everybody sucked but him. And so you can imagine, it's like hammer and tongs on a child's brain. I I'm a very flawed person, but I shudder when I think, how much worse it could have been. I don't know how I escaped, but part of that is that even from the very start, I never really bought their bullshit. I had very
Mm.
little choice but to go along with the program because I'm a child, and it
Yeah.
certainly took
Yeah.
me a few years once I got left them to kind of come out of a stupor and go, this is, I don't have to even live up here anymore. I can get out of
Mm.
this whole situation. But yeah, you know, the, uh, basically, I didn't buy it, and I was looking at it more objectively as time went on, and I realized that, for me, it was just, a really scary story, like terrifying propaganda is how I looked at it when I was a teenage, my late teens, and you know, I made lemonade out of the lemon. I've been using it ever since.
Yes, I think that's something a lot of us do. You know, I I don't want to sort of go into my own stuff too much, but I ran away from home when I was 16, and I thought I'd escaped the brainwashing that was going on, and it's just sort of decades later I realised that some of the brainwashing had actually taken and was still operating inside my head. I don't know if that's been your experience
It
of
yes,
things at all.
no, it is, and I empathize. And it for my part, I have to take responsibility for my flaws. It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
It really doesn't matter what happened when I was a kid. I mistakes that I still make are mine. But
yeah,
the fact of the matter is, this is what happened, and I fight very hard to surround myself with people that are not like that, that
yeah,
are intellectually curious, that are kind, and that are loving and accepting. And
yeah.
I found that that's been, you know, I guess one other thing that I really had going for me, even though we didn't have as much contact as I would have liked, I have an aunt who really, I would say in some ways, spiritually rescued me in my youth, because she was always someone that I could turn to and go, what, you know, my parents are saying this or society is saying that. I feel that's wrong. What do and she never took sides or anything like that, but she would just listen, and then she would give me her opinion, and she was always, and she was always very kind, and she was extremely progressive, for a woman growing up in Alaska in the 70s and 80s. And if not for her, I think I'd be in a lot of trouble.
Yes. I also remember there were various friends of the family or friends, but every now and again they'd say something along the lines of, "You realize your mother isn't very well."
Uh,
She wasn't. She was not a well woman. She had a lot of things going on. But anyway, enough about that. I was very struck by Andy Kaufman creeping through the trees. Because we all, guilty myself, have our daydreams about this celebrity or that famous person suddenly wanting to be our friend. But why Andy Kaufman?
uh, that would be one reason right there. Um, just that reaction. Why this person? And I'm like, it's a valid question, but it's also part of the answer. Uh, but in a lot of ways, I chose Kaufman. There was two central reasons, because of the kind of story I wanted to
Mm,
write. And one of the aspects of of choosing Kaufman is because he scared me when I was a child.
all right.
Young teen, adolescent. Taxi, the famous comedy that he was on. Uh,
Vaguely remember it. Yep.
right, and that was, it was long ago. I can't remember what year it came out, but I remember. And of course, we were living in the woods, and we had a little black and white TV, and
Mm,
that station, I want to say it was ABC, but I could be wrong. It didn't come in very well, and so we very seldom saw it. But I saw it often enough, and I also caught his act sometimes on late night TV shows and stuff. And I'm going to circle you back to what I was, even as a kid, I didn't buy
mm,
into what I consider to be propaganda. Like, I always had this gift for seeing through things as a child, and I knew, I thought he was a liar. Like, I saw it through his shtick. Like,
yeah.
I never once bought it. Now, I'm not trying to say he was secretly an evil person, nothing like that. I'm just saying, as a kid, though, I
Mm,
was I was mature enough to recognize that it was all a con, but I was immature in the sense that I didn't understand that it's a super high level of humor. So
yeah.
all I saw was the uncanny valley, and he was a big old howling void of an uncanny valley for me. So that's one reason why I chose him, is because for some people he's simply Andy Kaufman. There's
Yeah.
nothing sinister about him. But for some of us, there's a subset of people that encountered him in youth. His affect is such that you're like, that guy's a serial killer, or
Mm,
he's giving off the vibe. Maybe he isn't, but he's giving off the vibe. Like, he's intentionally giving off that vibe.
yeah.
And so that was one reason. I just thought, no, he's this. He's like, potentially the super villain, like right under your nose. Like he pulls off this camouflage trick. The other reason that I chose him
Mm,
for because of what I was trying to do is because of his alter egos. He had, like, Tony Clifton was the major alter ego, which is basically this character that he created that would say nice things about Andy Kaufman. He was a lounge singer, and so he would do. Andy Kaufman would introduce him, and then Tony Clifton would come out, and sometimes he would have other actors playing Tony Clifton, from what I understand, and sometimes he would be Tony Clifton. He'd wear like a wig, and he had padding to make himself look like he was heavier and all this stuff. And so it was just this meta game. And of course, Andy Kaufman never broke character, and Tony Clifton never broke. And a lot of the people who helped them with their shtick never broke character. And so I just took all that and said, man, it's perfect for a weird fiction horror story. And I
Yeah.
wanted to, and then of course the other aspect of it was I wanted to write a story imagining like what would happen if Wes Anderson, like Royal Tannenbaum guy, what or Paul, yeah, what if he wrote a horror story, or Linklater, the guy that did Dazed and Confused, what if one of them wrote a horror story, and so that's what I did.
All right. I wonder if you've heard of a British paedophile by the name of Jimmy Savile.
Very
Uh,
vaguely.
vaguely. I remember that I was always super creeped out by Jimmy Savile. Right back when, it was pretty much blasphemy to say that you didn't like Jimmy Savile. And
Oh
so
yeah,
when he
yes,
was,
I do know what you're talking about. I've been reading
yes,
about all the
so when he
exposés
was
and yes,
outed, I thought, well, I
yeah,
always knew there was something wrong about him.
right. He got outed as
Whereas,
being a terrible. Yeah, I
yeah,
remember that.
Wolf Harris was also outed as being a paedophile. And that was a major shock to me because I never once, ever got a creepy vibe from him. So, I just basically learnt through the years that I'm actually crap at, I might be right on occasion, but I'm dead wrong on other occasions. So there
I'm
you
probably in the
go.
same boat.
Yeah, it's people will always find a way of surprising you, I think, really. Um,
Right.
so I understand that in recent years you've turned away from supernatural horror to do more detective type stuff. Have I got that right?
Yes and no. It's funny. It takes people a while to catch up with you. Yeah, from
Mm.
2018. Okay, so I wrote those first three collections, into
Yeah,
2010. Uh, actually into 2013. Sorry, and then I started working on Swift to Chase, which came out in 2016. That was still supernatural horror, but it was less cosmic
yeah,
horror. There was some cosmic horror, some Lovecraftian, but it was much more weird fiction and psychological horror, and just other types of horror. And some of it may or may not have been supernatural, might have just been psychological. And then in 2017, I started working on my Coleridge, series, which is my detective series, and that becomes more and more kind of. It starts off as just pure, it's crime, mystery, thriller, no supernatural overtones really. But by the third book, and there's a fourth, there's the novella that came out last year, but I would say it's fairly supernatural again, and that kind of is the whole deal with my career right now. Is yeah, there was about a 3 year stretch there, 3 or 4 years where I was working on novels, and they definitely weren't capital H horror novels, and so they were definitely much more slanted toward mainstream crime or mystery. But I'm definitely sliding back into, or headed back into supernatural, the uh, cosmic horror, because I'm working on fantasy, dark fantasy series, or I shouldn't say series. It's a setting, and I'm working on a novel in that setting. And then I've written quite a few stories the last couple of years that are science fiction horror and cosmic horror as well.
can you tell me something a bit more about this setting?
Oh, the fantasy setting, sure. I'm pretty excited about it. I feel that it's sort of me as a writer, but just as a person coming full circle. When I was little, my favorite fiction from the time I was, a wee lad, was fantasy, various types of
Yeah,
fantasy or soft science fiction, and I was big into Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter series. I liked the Hobbit, all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. Anne McCaffrey's The Pern, the dragons, the dragon
Oh,
riders,
yes, yes.
right? Jack Vance, Dying Earth, all kinds of stuff like that. I really really loved it. Michael Moorcock,
Mm.
obviously, Elric.
Tanifully?
Yes, actually, Tanith Lee was one of the first fantasy I read. Birthgrave, so
Yes,
which is pretty
yes,
harsh for a 9-year-old, 10-year-old, but that's one of the first.
it is. But
Yep.
I think it's one of
Uh,
the best novels ever written, full stop.
Tanith Lee was a
Certainly
legend.
my favorite fantasy one, yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff I was reading. I was reading everything, but that was stuff that I really loved, and I wanted to write it. And so when I was writing as a adolescent, 99% of everything I wrote was fantasy or science fiction that was essentially fantasy. And
Yeah.
it wasn't until I was, in my 30s and I started writing professionally that I really consistently wrote. I'd written horror prior to that, but I wrote a lot more horror. I focused on horror, when I turned pro.
Mm.
But so what I'm working on now is that kind of thing. I am thinking about Tanith Lee and Gene Wolfe and Michael Moorcock. I'm thinking about Glenn Cook, The Black Company. Jack Vance's Dying Earth. All that. Fritz Leiber,
Mm.
Wofford and the Grey Mouser, and doing my own thing with it. I feel that I'm able to take all the writing I've done in crime and the writing that I've done in contemporary and historical horror and mash that all together for this setting that I call antiquity, which is basically like a very fractured through the looking glass version of North America and Europe. It's anachronistic. People like gladiators are coexisting with Renaissance level technology. Things move around. They're talking animals. There are regular animals. There are monsters. There are sorcerers. There are guys with old relic laser guns, and I'm kind of fusing that all together in my own unique sort of stew.
And this sort of immediately segues into the Laird Barron mapping project,
Hmm.
which kind of sort of it's a map of the various things that you've written about.
It's
Do you have
tremendous.
any input into that?
No, there's the mapping project by Slow.
Mm.
I don't know who the author of that site is. They go by Slow to Chase.
Oh, yeah.
And there's another one, Eve Terigny, the digital artist and game designer. He also has a site where it's a concordance of all my work, and he basically breaks down stories and does like scholarly overviews of them. I love those two sites. I have a little more input into Eve's, only in the sense that he will ask me occasionally. He'll send me an email and ask me for clarification on something, but I actually strongly try to avoid uh, tampering with those guys. I'm happy to answer
Yeah.
questions, but I feel like don't muzzle the ox that pulls the plow. I mean, you stay the hell away and let them
Mm.
have their conversations. Let them hash it out. Same thing with the Reddit. There's a Reddit site that Greg Green has devoted to my work, and I have occasionally popped in, and I've certainly been happy to do interviews with them. But generally speaking, like I would say 99.9% of the time, I try to stay well away just because I feel like it's their conversation, not mine.
Yeah. Right. So now to sort of go on to, you're quite active on social media, I believe. I'm following you on Twitter and I'm following you on Patreon. How do you find that helps your work, or does it at all?
No, so what's going on? It's interesting. I'm in an odd time. I've pretty much backed away from Twitter.
Mm.
I'm still there. I made the first post in several months just yesterday. I had something, or the day
Yeah.
before I had something to say. Generally speaking, though, I use social media, Blue Sky, Twitter, and Facebook. I used to post on there all the time,
Yeah.
and I loved it. I felt like it was good. It was a good way to build community because I haven't been to a convention in I've been to one convention in the last decade, maybe two, I guess, in the last decade. And so I don't, especially since COVID and since my own health issues, I don't get out. And so I really enjoy the luxury of being able to like have this conversation with you. I love the technology allows us to, and I've talked to you on Facebook or on Twitter and stuff. Um,
Yeah.
but I've pretty much withdrawn from daily posting on social media, and I'm only posting on as far as content. I'm only posting on Patreon. That
Yeah.
is wonderful for me. I miss certain aspects. I mean, Twitter was fun just to have random thoughts and post them whenever you felt like it. Patreon though is helping me in the sense that I feel like I'm slowly migrating uh, a lot of essays. Like every essay I've ever done, I intend to migrate all those essays to the site eventually. Um, I used to have a live journal, and I had my own author site, and I had lots and lots of material on there, and I want to migrate all that into one safe place. And then, of course, I'm adding new stuff. I do essays, original essays. I try to do at least one of those a month, and I do vignettes and stories. Like I have an ongoing, episodic stories. But so it's like a two pronged mission for me. One is to migrate a lot of my work there, so it's like a repository. So it'll be there even if and when I kick the bucket eventually, there'll be a storehouse of stuff. There's a bibliography, but also so that I can just, anybody wants to talk to me, they can. There's a free following component, but we can chat, and it just it's something that I work at it every day. So it's actually I'm very goal oriented. So I'm like, oh, I have to do like I haven't done one today. After we get done talking, I have something planned. I'm going to put something up on Patreon, and I find that it activates a part of my brain that I don't use as much for when I'm writing fiction. So I'm exercising.
Yeah.
I find that it complements my writing life.
Right. Yes, because I'm following you on Patreon and a few other people, which you know, it's it's important to be supportive, really. If you want the good things to keep coming, then you have to, you know, keep supporting them, and for which I'm quite grateful. But
I'm really
with
grateful too for you guys because there's like I said the free component and there's various levels of paid, and I have
mm,
quite a few people that are supporting me. That they signed up for the various tiers, and
yeah,
between my health from the last couple of years and the fact that we lost our place where I was living for almost a decade suddenly, so we were forced to move, to relocate just suddenly. That was, I
yeah,
won't say catastrophic financially, but it wasn't good. And so,
mm,
you know, uh, it that's why I'm treating Patreon. Some people, it's kind of like it's something fun for them to do, or it's very a minor
yeah,
part. For me, I've been treating it like a job. People have been supporting me so much. I'm like, no,
mm,
this is part of my job as a
yeah,
writer now is
yeah,
to keep this an active, vibrant uh, place to find stuff that I'm doing.
right.
Oh, thank you,
Right,
Catherine.
we've just had a request from Matty Campbell. So if you could, well, anyway, just it's go. I'll find the address and I will put it up under the interview after this is closed. So don't worry, Matty. I'll keep you
Maddie, it's
in the loop.
Patreon. I don't have it right in front of me, but it's patreon.com. Laird Barron, I think, would take you to it, and it's called the
Oh, splendid.
Realms of Old Leech. But yeah, if you could put it up afterwards, that'd be really cool.
I will most definitely do that.
But I
And
I
as a
just want I
kind,
cannot reiterate it enough. The support that I've received from I have almost
mm,
500 patrons. I am really grateful for all the support.
that is
It's helped
really
me
impressive.
tremendously. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just get that money for the British Horror Society. Woo. But
Yeah,
also the
V,
amount of resources
definitely.
that are available to authors and fans alike nowadays is just fantastic. I mean, I love the 21st century, problems and all. Just
Oh,
so much. Mm,
Yeah, I'm with you. I listen. My first few years of submitting, and I submitted back in the '80s when I was a teenager,
mm,
and then again in the late '90s I started submitting. And I come from the era of it costs hundreds of dollars every year, postage and envelopes
mm.
and type and printing. If you're prolific, I mean, I was especially
Yeah.
if you try to get into Interzone or Black Static or anything overseas. Um, I love this era of you press a button and send it off. That's
Mm,
really nice.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we're coming towards the end of the interview now, so there's another question that I always ask everybody. Um, is there anything that you'd like to recommend to the listeners, whether it's a book or a movie or an artist?
Oh
Well,
boy.
now's the
Uh,
chance.
hey, that's wonderful. Yeah, I would say, and Joe, please don't get mad because I always forget how to pronounce your last name. It's Joe Koch or Joe Cook, Koch. Uh, but he has a collection out called Invaginese, which is just you know uh, spectacular. Just came out,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm reading a bunch of really good stuff. But in the crime realm, a guy named Matt Riordan wrote a novel. Just came out earlier this year called. I could be wrong. It actually might have come out last fall, but it's very recent. It's called The North Line, and it is I want to say kind of a thriller. It's a low key thriller set in Alaska about a guy that goes up there to make some quick money commercial fishing, and
Mm-hmm.
but it's definitely noir crime thriller oriented. The North Line. Those are two things that I would highly recommend. I mean, there's so much good stuff out right now. I'm reading stuff by Richard Gavin and Ian Rogers. Uh, manuscripts. And for viewing, I just there's two things I would recommend. Actually, I'll just stick with one thing. Mister In Between. It came out a few years ago. I want to say the final. It was 3 seasons, and I want to say the final season was like in 2020 or 2021. Recently.
Yeah.
They're very short seasons. They're like 10 episodes, and they're like half an hour. And it's labeled as a comedy. But it's it's amusing, but it's not a comedy. It's about an
Yeah.
Australian hitman. One of the greatest. If you're into, like, if you like Breaking Bad, Justified, crime, kind of noir television, it's one of the greatest examples
Mm,
of that I've ever seen. I absolutely love that show.
wonderful. Well, I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you so much for coming along and giving of your time. It's lovely to see all the audience interaction. So I want to say thank you to everybody who came along to listen to this, and also for everybody who's watching this after the fact. Thank you all very much. Um, yeah, thank you very much. If you do like this, please consider subscribing. And do check out the various resources that have been mentioned, including the Patreon, the Concordance, the Reddit group by Greg Green, and let's not forget the Laird Barron mapping project. Plus, of course, you can buy his audiobooks on Audible.
And lest I be uh, thrashed by my publisher, I do have a new collection coming out on September 10th, um,
Hmm.
called Not a Speck of Light, and it's my first,
Oh,
collection since 2016. So stay tuned for that. Bad Hand Books is bringing it out.
I'll be getting that. Anyway, so
And
I'd
one
like
last
to
thing,
say,
it's actually illustrated by the great Trevor Henderson. So there's some really creepy illustrations in it.
right, I'm going to have to Google him. I'm going to have to Google him the moment we finished. So I'm going to say good night to everybody. And Laird, would you like to say good night?
Good night, everybody, and thank you for being here. And thank you for all your support. And Julia, thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much.